A wrongfully convicted black man, facing his final moments before execution, made a heartbreaking request to see his beloved German Shepherd one last time. What happens next will break your heart. Ethan Harris had spent 19 long years on death row, each day carved out of a life that had been taken from him unfairly. He was only 23 when he had been convicted of a crime he did not commit: the murder of a white woman in a quiet southern town. The trial had been a whirlwind of bias and presumption, held in a community where Ethan's skin color rendered him guilty before the evidence was even presented. The case against him had rested on the shaky testimony of a single eyewitness, a man whose statement had been riddled with inconsistencies. But the system had worked against Ethan, and, one by one, his appeals had been denied. With each rejection, hope slipped further out of reach, leaving him to reconcile himself to the inevitability of his fate. Before his arrest, Ethan had lived a modest but fulfilling life. He had been a loving father to his young daughter, a devoted husband, and a skilled dog trainer. Shadow, his German Shepherd, had been his pride and joy. More than just a pet, Shadow had been a loyal companion, always at Ethan's side whether he was working in the yard, training other dogs, or simply sitting on the porch after a long day. The bond between man and dog had been unshakable, a quiet understanding that required no words. Shadow had been there the day Ethan proposed to his wife and had been the first to curl up protectively by his newborn daughter's crib. Ethan's arrest had shattered that life in an instant. The day the police came for him was etched into his memory with painful clarity. Shadow had barked incessantly as the officers approached, sensing their hostility and his owner's distress. When Ethan was handcuffed, Shadow lunged toward the officers, growling and barking in a desperate attempt to protect him. Ethan had called out to calm the dog, his voice breaking as he was shoved into the back of a squad car. The last thing he saw as the car pulled away was Shadow, standing at the edge of the yard, his ears perked and his tail low, as if waiting for Ethan to return. That image haunted Ethan in the years that followed, a lingering reminder of everything he had lost. Inside his cell, the memories of Shadow became a lifeline. On sleepless nights, Ethan would close his eyes and imagine the dog resting his head on his lap, his deep brown eyes full of loyalty and understanding. He remembered the feel of Shadow's fur beneath his fingers, the way the dog's tail would wag lazily when Ethan spoke to him. Those memories were a refuge, a mental escape from the cold, unyielding walls that surrounded him. Over time, they became more than memories. They were a promise he made to himself, a promise to hold on to some fragment of his former life. As the years dragged on, Ethan watched as his appeals were denied one by one. His attorney, Daniel Price, fought tirelessly on his behalf, presenting new evidence that pointed to his innocence and questioning the credibility of the original trial. But the courts were unmoved. Daniel's frustration was palpable, but Ethan had long since stopped expecting justice. The system that had taken his freedom wasn't about to give it back. The day the date of his execution was set, Ethan sat quietly in his cell, staring at the small calendar pinned to the wall. He had known this day was coming, but seeing it confirmed in writing felt like a final blow. The guards were unusually quiet as they passed his cell, their usual taunts replaced by a subdued silence. It was as if the looming reality of Ethan's fate had stripped them of their usual bravado. In the days that followed, the prison staff began the grim process of preparing for Ethan's final moments. Warden Frank Miller, a man known for his rigid adherence to rules, took no pleasure in the task but viewed it as a necessary part of the job. Ethan, meanwhile, was calm and composed, his demeanor almost unnervingly serene. When asked if he had any final requests, he made only one: to see Shadow one last time. The request was met with skepticism. Allowing a dog into the prison was far from standard procedure, and the warden saw no reason to make an exception. To him, Ethan was just another inmate, another name on a list of executions he had overseen during his tenure. But Daniel Price refused to let the matter rest. He argued passionately on Ethan's behalf, pointing out that the request was simple, harmless, and deeply meaningful to a man who had already been robbed of so much. Daniel wasn't just advocating for a dying man's wish, he was fighting for Ethan's humanity, a humanity that had been denied at every turn. Warden Miller eventually relented, though his agreement was grudging. Shadow would be allowed to visit Ethan on the morning of his execution, under strict supervision. The decision sparked debate among the prison staff. Some viewed it as an act of compassion, a rare moment of humanity in an otherwise cold and unforgiving system. Others saw it as unnecessary, a bending of rules for a man who, in their eyes, didn't deserve special treatment. When Daniel delivered the news to Ethan, the usually reserved man's eyes filled with emotion. He placed a hand over his heart, nodding slowly as he processed the attorney's words. In a soft voice, he thanked Daniel, not just for the opportunity to see Shadow, but for fighting for him in ways that no one else ever had. It was a moment of connection that transcended the walls of the prison, a reminder that even in the darkest places, humanity could still shine through. As the date drew closer, Ethan's thoughts were consumed by the upcoming reunion. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something other than resignation. The thought of seeing Shadow again, of holding the dog who had been his constant companion, filled him with a bittersweet sense of anticipation. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to sustain him as he faced the end. The morning of Ethan Harris's execution arrived cloaked in a heavy gray sky, the chill in the air matching the somber weight of the day. Ethan sat quietly on the edge of his cot, his hands resting in his lap. He stared at the barren wall in front of him, his mind far from the cold cell that had been his world for nearly 2 decades. He thought only of Shadow, the loyal German shepherd who had been his companion in another life. The thought of seeing the dog one last time carried him through the oppressive silence, giving him a flicker of hope amid the finality of the morning. When a guard approached with Ethan's breakfast tray, he barely acknowledged it. The stale eggs and lukewarm coffee held no appeal. He pushed the tray aside, his focus entirely on the hours ahead. A second guard arrived soon after, signaling that it was time. Ethan stood without hesitation, his movements steady despite the gravity of what lay before him. The guards flanked him as they escorted him to the visitation room, their usual sternness tempered by an unspoken understanding of the moment's weight. Meanwhile, outside the prison gates, Daniel Price stepped out of his car, holding tightly to Shadow's leash. The dog, now older and tinged with gray around his muzzle, moved with a vitality that belied his years. Shadow had been living with Ethan's sister Marie since Ethan's incarceration, but his loyalty to his original owner had never wavered. Shadow sniffed the air, his ears perking up as if he could sense something important was happening. His tail wagged slowly, then faster as Daniel knelt beside him, murmuring a few soothing words before approaching the entrance. The guards at the gate eyed the unusual visitor, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to indifference. They led Daniel and Shadow through a series of security checks, the atmosphere clinical and cold. Shadow's nails clicked against the polished floors as he followed Daniel, his head swiveling to take in the unfamiliar surroundings. The dog seemed uneasy but obedient, glancing up at Daniel every few steps for reassurance. Daniel reached down periodically to pat his head, his touch firm but comforting. Finally, they reached the visitation room. The door loomed heavy and Daniel paused before it, crouching beside Shadow to adjust his leash. The dog's tail wagged again, faster now, as though he knew what was on the other side of the door. Daniel gave him a final pat before straightening and signaling to the guard that they were ready. The door creaked open, and the room came into view. Inside, Ethan stood frozen in place. For a moment, the sterile room with its gray walls and metal furniture seemed to melt away, leaving only the sight of Shadow in the doorway. Time seemed to slow as the man and dog locked eyes, their connection transcending the years and the distance that had separated them. Shadow's reaction was immediate. He barked, a sharp, excited sound that echoed through the room, before breaking into a sprint. His leash slipped from Daniel's hand as the dog bolted toward Ethan, his tail wagging furiously. Ethan dropped to his knees, his arms outstretched as Shadow leapt into his embrace. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he buried his head in the dog's fur, his shoulders shaking with emotion. Shadow licked his face, whining softly, his tail thumping against the floor with unrestrained joy. For a moment, it was as though the years of separation had never happened. The bond between them, forged in loyalty and love, remained unbroken. The guards, who had been instructed to monitor the visit closely, stood back. Their typically hardened expressions softened as they watched the reunion unfold. One of them shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Ethan and Shadow as though unsure whether to intervene or allow the moment to continue. Ultimately, none of them moved to disrupt the fragile peace that had settled over the room. Ethan held Shadow tightly, his hands trembling as they moved over the dog's fur. He spoke softly, his voice trembling with emotion. He told Shadow about the memories that had kept him going, the long nights he had spent imagining the dog's head resting on his knee, the way Shadow's tail had wagged whenever Ethan had walked through the door. Shadow tilted his head as if listening, his brown eyes full of understanding. He leaned into Ethan's touch, his body pressing close as though trying to comfort the man he had waited so long to see. Daniel stood quietly in the corner, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched the scene unfold. He had fought countless battles in courtrooms, but none of them had prepared him for the raw humanity of this moment. His throat tightened and he blinked rapidly, trying to suppress the tears that threatened to spill over. Even the warden, who had initially opposed the visit, lingered near the doorway, his stern face uncharacteristically softened by what he was witnessing. For nearly an hour, Ethan and Shadow were inseparable. Ethan stroked the dog's fur, his touch gentle but deliberate, as if trying to memorize every detail. Shadow rested his head on Ethan's knee, his eyes closing briefly before snapping open again, as though afraid to waste a single second of their time together. Ethan murmured words of gratitude, his voice cracking with emotion. Shadow responded with soft whines and an occasional bark, his tail thumping rhythmically against the floor. The room, usually cold and lifeless, seemed transformed by the reunion. The guards remained silent, their usual aloofness replaced by a quiet respect for the bond they were witnessing. Daniel glanced at his watch, his heart sinking as he realized their time was running out. But he couldn't bring himself to interrupt. He knew what this moment meant to Ethan. It was more than just a final request. It was a fleeting glimpse of the life that had been stolen from him. The weight of the day hung heavily in the air as the minutes slipped away. Ethan sat on the cold metal chair in the visitation room, his hand never leaving Shadow's head. The dog's fur was soft beneath his fingers, a sensation he had clung to in his memories for nearly 2 decades. Now, as the time for his execution approached, he felt the fragile peace of their reunion begin to waver under the crushing finality of what was to come. Shadow sat obediently at Ethan's feet, his tail swishing gently against the floor as if to remind Ethan that he was still there, still loyal, even in these final moments. The room, once filled with quiet conversation and the warmth of their bond, grew heavier with silence as the reality of their parting loomed closer. Ethan's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of years and injustice pressing down on him. Yet he remained steady, determined to hold on to every last second he had with the dog who had been his constant companion in his thoughts, if not in person. The door creaked open, breaking the stillness. A guard stepped inside, his usual stoicism replaced by a subdued expression. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaccustomed to moments like this. Clearing his throat, he spoke softly, almost apologetically, as he informed Ethan that the visit would have to come to an end. The words struck Ethan like a blow, but he merely nodded, his hand still brushing over Shadow's fur in slow, deliberate strokes. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. He stayed seated, his gaze fixed on Shadow, taking in every detail. The gray around the dog's muzzle, the faint scar above his eye from an old accident, the way his ears twitched at every sound. Ethan committed it all to memory, knowing it would be the last time he would ever see his beloved companion. Shadow tilted his head, sensing the shift in energy. His deep brown eyes met Ethan's, filled with a mix of loyalty and confusion, as if he could feel the weight of the moment but didn't fully understand its significance. Ethan leaned down slowly, his movements deliberate, and pressed his forehead against Shadow's. He closed his eyes, the faint scent of the dog's fur bringing back a flood of memories. Long walks in the park, nights spent sitting on the porch, and the sound of Shadow's bark echoing through their old home. Ethan's voice trembled as he whispered, his words meant for Shadow alone. He thanked the dog for being his constant, his protector, his friend. "You were the best friend I ever had," he said, his voice breaking on the final word. Shadow let out a soft whine, nudging Ethan's hand with his nose as if to comfort him. His tail thumped lightly against the floor, a faint rhythmic sound that seemed to echo the unspoken bond between them. Ethan stroked the dog's head one last time, his fingers trembling as they brushed over Shadow's ears and down his neck. He didn't want to let go, but he knew he had to. The time had come. Daniel Price, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. His eyes were misted with emotion, and his normally confident demeanor was subdued. He crouched down beside Shadow, placing a reassuring hand on the dog's back before gently tugging on the leash. Shadow hesitated, his gaze flicking back to Ethan, his body resisting the pull as if he knew this was goodbye. Ethan straightened, his hands falling to his lap as he watched Daniel lead Shadow toward the door. Each step Shadow took felt like a knife twisting in Ethan's chest. The dog turned his head repeatedly, his ears perked and his tail wagging faintly, as if waiting for Ethan to follow. Ethan offered a small, bittersweet smile, his lips pressing together tightly to hold back the emotions threatening to spill over. "Go on, boy," he murmured softly, his voice so quiet it barely reached the ears of those in the room. As the door closed behind Shadow, the room was plunged into a suffocating silence. Ethan remained seated, his gaze fixed on the empty space where the dog had stood just moments before. His heart ached in a way he hadn't thought possible, a deep, visceral pain that seemed to hollow out his chest. Yet beneath the sorrow was a profound sense of gratitude. He had been given a gift, a fleeting but precious moment of connection with the creature who had been his anchor in a life that had been stripped of so much. The guards waited by the door, their usual brusqueness replaced by a rare sense of deference. They didn't rush him, giving Ethan the space to process the moment in his own time. Finally, Ethan rose from his chair, his movement slow but deliberate. He glanced once more at the door through which Shadow had exited, as if hoping for a final glimpse. When none came, he straightened his shoulders and turned to face the guards. As they escorted him back to his cell, Ethan walked with a quiet dignity. The ache in his heart was heavy, but he carried it with the knowledge that he had been given a moment of light in the darkness. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, not because he had been exonerated or because justice had been served, but because he had been reminded of love, loyalty, and the bonds that endure even in the face of unimaginable hardship. Back in his cell, Ethan sat on the edge of his cot, his hands resting in his lap. The sounds of the prison, clanging metal doors, distant shouts, faded into the background as he closed his eyes and let his mind drift. In his thoughts, he saw Shadow as he had been in their younger years, running through the fields, his tail wagging and his eyes bright. That memory and the fresh warmth of their reunion would carry him through the final hours of his life. The story of Ethan Harris's final wish spread like wildfire, carried from news outlets to social media and beyond. It began as a quiet human interest piece, a somber tale of a man on death row asking only for the companionship of his dog in his final hours. But as more details emerged about Ethan's wrongful conviction, the racial biases that had condemned him, and the unwavering loyalty of his German shepherd, Shadow, the story became a lightning rod for a much larger conversation. It resonated deeply with people across the country, sparking debates about the humanity of death row inmates, the flaws in the justice system, and the power of love even in the face of insurmountable odds. Activists quickly rallied around Ethan's story. Advocacy groups dedicated to fighting wrongful convictions used it as a powerful example of the systemic failures that disproportionately affected people of color. Articles dissected the racial disparities in the justice system, highlighting how Ethan's case was emblematic of a pattern of injustice rather than an isolated incident. Protesters gathered outside courthouses and state buildings, holding signs that bore Ethan's name alongside phrases like "Justice for the Innocent" and "End the Death Penalty." Social media amplified the story, with hashtags like Ethan and Shadow and Legacy of Love trending for days. Videos of Shadow's reunion with Ethan, taken by a sympathetic prison staff member, went viral, moving millions to tears. The image of a man kneeling on a sterile floor, embracing his aging dog as if the world outside no longer existed, became a symbol of resilience and love in the face of unimaginable hardship. It was shared by celebrities, activists, and everyday people, each adding their own reflections on what Ethan's story meant to them. Shadow, the loyal German shepherd who had waited so many years to see his owner again, became a symbol in his own right. Photos of Shadow, his graying muzzle pressed against Ethan's face, circulated widely. Pet owners and animal advocates connected with the story on a deeply personal level, many commenting on the purity of the bond between humans and animals. Shelters reported an uptick in adoptions, with people inspired to give dogs like Shadow a loving home. For Daniel Price, Ethan's attorney, the story was both a source of pride and a painful reminder of the work still to be done. He had fought tirelessly to prove Ethan's innocence, poring over old case files, tracking down witnesses, and petitioning the courts at every level. Though he had failed to stop the execution, he found solace in knowing he had given Ethan a measure of peace in his final hours. Shadow's presence had been a small victory, a testament to the humanity that had so often been denied to his client. After Ethan's death, Daniel adopted Shadow, determined to ensure that the dog's remaining years were filled with love and care. Shadow adjusted quickly to his new home, often curling up at Daniel's feet while he worked late into the night on other cases. Every now and then, Daniel would catch Shadow staring out the window, his ears perking up at the sound of a car passing by. It was in those moments that Daniel felt Ethan's presence most strongly, as if the man's spirit lingered in the dog's quiet loyalty. Shadow became a constant reminder of why Daniel had chosen this line of work. The dog's gentle presence and the memories of Ethan's quiet strength renewed his resolve to fight for justice, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Daniel began speaking at events and conferences, sharing Ethan's story and advocating for reforms in the justice system. His voice carried the weight of personal experience, and his words resonated deeply with audiences who saw in him a man who had been forever changed by the fight for one innocent life. The impact of Ethan's story reached far beyond Daniel and Shadow. Lawmakers in several states introduced bills aimed at preventing wrongful convictions, citing Ethan's case as a tragic example of why reforms were urgently needed. Organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform saw a surge in donations and volunteers, many of whom were inspired by Ethan's legacy. Conversations about race, justice, and the humanity of those on death row became more prominent, challenging long-held assumptions and encouraging people to look more critically at the systems in place. For Ethan's family, the outpouring of support was bittersweet. They mourned the loss of a brother, a father, and a friend, but they took comfort in knowing that his story had touched so many lives. Ethan's sister, Marie, often spoke about the man he had been before his life was stolen, a devoted father, a skilled dog trainer, and a man who had always tried to do right by others. She became an advocate in her own right, sharing Ethan's story at rallies and panels, determined to ensure that no one else would suffer the way her brother had. Though Ethan's life had been cut tragically short, his legacy continued to grow. His story became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, love and loyalty could endure. Shadow's unwavering devotion to his owner resonated with people around the world, inspiring them to believe in the power of connection and compassion. In the end, Ethan's final wish had been a simple one: to see the dog he had loved so deeply one last time. But that wish, and the story behind it, became a catalyst for change, sparking a movement that sought to shine a light on the darkest corners of the justice system. Though his life had been filled with pain and loss, Ethan's memory became a force for good, a testament to the enduring power of love and the possibility of redemption. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of injustice, wrongful convictions, and the deep bond between humans and animals. Its purpose is to shed light on flaws within the justice system and inspire empathy and a call for reform.